All right. So I'll try to keep this brainstorm probably to 45 minutes so that we're kind of back on schedule. But depends a little bit on how we go. Maybe if it's super valuable and interesting, we'll keep going. We'll see. So I sent most of you have filled in a survey in advance, and thank you very much for doing that so that we're not starting these discussions from scratch. And one of the questions I asked you guys is, what do you think are the known facts about tinnitus, meaning the things that all or most experts can agree on? And what do you think are the unknowns or the gaps that we still need to fill in order to get to cure? And what was interesting right off the bat is that when I was synthesizing these answers, the text for the unknowns was much, much longer than the text for the knowns. So that already gives us an indication of what we are dealing with. And I'll just take you briefly through a summary of the survey results. So in terms of knowns, it's mainly in three areas. So models, relation to hearing loss, and heterogeneity. So in terms of models, most people seem to agree tinnitus originates in the brain. It's a phantom percept or central auditory phenomenon that arises when the brain compensates for reduced or missing auditory input through maladaptive neuroplastic changes. It's a network problem involving central auditory and non-auditory systems. In terms of relation to hearing loss, it's generally agreed that hearing loss or cochlear damage is the most common trigger, but not the only one. In most cases, tinnitus is initiated in the ear through some peripheral damage, but maintained or amplified in the brain. And restoring the auditory input can sometimes, but not always, reduce the symptoms. In terms of heterogeneity, there's not all that much common ground, but the most commonly given answer is that the distinction between sensory related versus other forms of tinnitus, and the distinction between, I guess this is the difference between tinnitus and tinnitus disorder, I suppose. So that was the common ground. And then in terms of the unknowns, I have two slides. Again, it was a longer list. There's no agreement on the precise neural mechanisms of tinnitus. There's no agreement on the biological underpinnings or who is predisposed to tinnitus or why. There's no agreement on, or there's no commonly accepted objective measurement, which we've talked about extensively already before lunch. There's no agreement on what is a meaningful way of subtyping tinnitus. There's a lack of understanding on how tinnitus becomes chronic and how to reverse that process. There's a lack of clear therapeutic targets in terms of where and how to intervene. And there are many research and infrastructure gaps, some of which we've also discussed this morning. So yeah, that's a fairly long list. What I thought would be interesting is to go back to the knowns and discuss this a little bit more. Yeah. I guess I have two questions about this, because if you look at this list, it's pretty basic, right? If you would rate it on a scale from 0 to 100, this common level of understanding, 100 being a common level of understanding that immediately gives us a cure. I would say it was maybe a 10 or something. It doesn't get us maybe all that far. I guess I have two questions. So one is, does everyone actually agree on this list, or is even this very basic list still under dispute in some way? So you have disputes? Okay, so we already have disputes. There we go. See, even the basic list is not agreed on. But then secondly, for the things we do agree on, can we make it more specific? Because this is still very general, the way this is phrased, right? But yeah, I guess we start with the disputes. We have Marlies and Peter. Marlies?
It's only because even in the first sentences, for my opinion, it's a little bit controversial, because if it's an agreement that there is a central auditory phenomenon that arises when the brain compensates for reduced or missing auditory input. So this then reduced or missing auditory input is of course something which is not brain. So therefore, I only wanted to sensitize because I see in the scene there is an agreement that it's probably correlated with a reduced thalamocortical input. There's an agreement with excitability in the ascending aspect. There's an agreement. So it must have something to do with the peripheral. Only the first sentence is a little.
Wait, so how would you rephrase it exactly?
It's not sure, mate.
I need exact wording.
Maybe it's a different.
Tinnitus originate in the subcortical or cortical. I don't know. So it's there must be
means exactly the same because subcortical and cortical is both in the brain, but
it's in the brain.
I think that the term originates is probably problematic because we would all agree without a brain there would be no tinnitus.
That's a good. That's fine.
Yeah.
It's worth it, but
Good. Yeah. Let's hear from Peter then.
As you can guess, my intervention is going to be
I know what you're
controversial, but that's what we're here for. Tinnitus originates in the brain. I mean, tinnitus originates in a loud sound, which has nothing to do with the brain. The question is maintained tinnitus maintained because of activity in the brain? Now, Bertholdt, he's probably going to deny this now, but he told me a very interesting thing, and please correct me if I've got it wrong, which says that IV lidocaine abolishes tinnitus in a few minutes.
Yeah.
It's not a useful therapy because it's very short-lasting.
Yeah.
But IV lidocaine is not going to penetrate into the blood, into the brain quickly. So this tells us that something important is happening in the periphery.
in the periphery.
I don't know. This seems to me conclusive.
agree.
yeah. So maybe if I can add on this, so there are different subtypes, and there is this ambiguity. Tinnitus originates in the brain. So what does that mean? So we all agree that tinnitus is related to a neural activity. Okay, so what is this neural activity? Is it simply an increase of spontaneous activity? Is it a network activity? But so if it's related to a spontaneous activity somewhere in the system, so that spontaneous activity may be produced in the periphery at the cochlear level or in the centers. And it's maybe, so do we agree on that dichotomy between central tinnitus and peripheral tinnitus, from the beginning? And so this sentence assume that all the time 100% of tinnitus originates in the brain. So maybe it's the controversy, and it's
the percept is generated in the brain. The conscious percept.
The conscious percept causes the percept is generated.
we need a network activity, but we need also
This is without doubt.
Yes.
That's what they were trying to find an agreement. What do we?
Well, we can all agree on that as well.
Well,
If you haven't got a brain and you can't
because the conscious percept of the tinnitus is generated in the brain.
So it can be central, but also
It can be
peripheral.
triggered in the
The beginning of this activity, this abnormal activity.
Yeah. But it sounds like you'll kind of agree.
Yeah, it's just the wording that is. It's a semantic discussion.
Yeah,
Right,
it's
it's
a
the same.
discussion.
It's just that tinnitus is a very general term, right? I have pulsatile tinnitus, which is definitely not in the brain. But then you need to understand the underlying meaning of what are neural natural. So central tinnitus generally originates on the brain or is perceived.
I mean, that's a good point, whether it's type 1 or type 2, right? The tinnitus.
What do you mean to one?
It's
Subjective or secondary tinnitus. So, this
Pulsatile tinnitus is separate from the brain, right?
Yeah, of course. It was just an example about this.
Subjective versus objective.
I think nobody sits here for the closer to understand. No, of course, right. We can agree on that very quickly.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, that's actually an area of agreement.
and I think maybe what's from what I, of course, know is the one question is, where does it originate? and where does it manifest?
Yeah.
Right.
Those are two things I think it definitely, I don't know if I can say that, but it manifests in the brain, that's for sure. Yeah. So because this is, I think, what you try to distinguish, because we're talking about first phase, somebody who experiences tinnitus for, if he's lucky, I don't know, 2 weeks, whatever, after a trauma or whatever, and then it just goes away.
But there is pulsatile tinnitus, which does not exist in the brain because it's a physical.
Yeah, but pulsatile, I would actually love that we find a new name for that, because it has nothing to do with the condition we're talking.
Okay, so then we should ignore it then. I guess that's very.
Just put pulsatile, it doesn't matter. That's not the...
This is yes. It's still we excluded something which helps us define it.
I think in the definitions, in the actual definition of tinnitus, this distinction is not made at all.
I know, this is what I
And I also don't like the term subjective or objective tinnitus. No, doesn't mean nothing from a clinical point of view, because I see 1/3 of the pulsatile tinnitus patients, I'm totally unable to find the cause. I can't hear it, I can't objective it without any MRI, CT scan, or radiography or whatever.
But then the question is,
it's a subjective, even if it's pulsatile.
Yeah.
So this is a real point. That from the beginning, we all assume that tinnitus is a continuous tinnitus triggered by an hearing loss with an hyperactivity or asynchrony within the brain or whatever. But not all tinnitus patients come to my clinic with this kind of very sharp and very straightforward distinction.
And also that type of tinnitus too, some people can modulate their tinnitus, right, by skull movement. So that's another differentiator.
But this is also a very dangerous thing. I would say 99% of all tinnitus patients can modulate their tinnitus with their jaw.
Yeah, I don't agree.
But this is what I see with the people I talk to with different backgrounds, and it says a majority
know that though.
for example, can do that, and this is why often, and that's a malinformation, for example, amongst patients, is that as soon as they can do something with their jaw and their tinnitus changes a little bit, they directly go on the somatosensory pathway of their thinking that there's a problem. But I don't know if that's something, but that's probably on the disagreement list. So,
So can we tweak this sentence in a way that people do agree on it? Because I didn't hear
the tinnitus perception, the conscious tinnitus perception is generated in the brain.
That's the first sentence.
Yeah.
So you just change that.
Involve
the conscious.
the conscious perception involves the brain, of course.
So we try to find a phrase that it's
So when we're going speed, now
so we are
that's like
so good.
that brain not experienced thing. Is that right?
This is something that we
agree on.
Yeah.
I think those are where the discussions that Charles Darwin had.
we can mention even Arno agrees.
Yeah. So man, just
But is the main disagreement?
No. The first part.
Which one? Oh, this one.
Yeah, that's
Yeah. Oh, sorry. I didn't get that was the area of disagreement. Okay. Okay. So this way is sort of agreed on.
Yeah, the description of everybody in the break. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Then we got that out of the way. Yeah. Is there any way we can, if you look at the points under the models, is there any way we can make any of this more specific while still generally agreeing on it?
hearing loss or cochlear damage is the most common trigger.
Yeah.
Can we change it? I know it's correct. Can we change it for deafferentation? Because outer hair cell, there's a lot of evidence that the outer hair cell which currently contribute to the threshold are not causatively involved. Would this find an agreement, or
I
do not know?
No.
If not, no, do not find an agreement. So the studies in so you think to DBOE, so a lot of Pim van Dijk and Auditory, so they really consciously did this, that the outer has a contribution contributing to cochlear amplification. Is not a primary trigger, then we could specify it. Good try though. Causative. I do not talk about if it's clearly a risk. It's clearly a risk. This does not mean that hearing loss is not a risk, but causively, it's not the active.
But we write is a trigger, so that's not trigger is a risk.
But trigger means causative.
No. Trigger does not mean sorry. Epidemiology is coming into actually the air. No.
No, trigger is
Causative. Yeah.
trigger can be also a risk factor.
It can be also just an association, just something. Just a trigger is not causative.
But we could do it a little bit more precise when we leave out then the trigger and say augmentation together.
This is
So we specify cochlear damage.
So what would your sentence be?
To deafferentation.
But I think this phrase just comes from evidence from epidemiological research that in the majority of tinnitus patients, we find some hearing loss.
Exactly.
That's the justification, and we don't know exactly about the type of hearing loss. So that's as with the.
And you can have deafferentation, we can have deafferentation without hearing. Also, you both this virtual says it's just epidemiological data.
Yeah, I know, but is it associated? So,
But then
Also could mention risk factor.
Triggers, smash.
but then you have a mindful of something good.
Okay. So, okay. But in terms of model, if we go back to it, let me remove mine. If we look at this first bit, so the conscious perception is generated in the brain. It's a phantom percept, but arises from the brain compensates for reduced input, Is there any way we can make that more specific?
I would say it's a subtype.
What's
It's not
the
all
subtype?
the second sentence.
Yeah.
It's not all tinnitus. But
Okay.
One subtype of tinnitus might be related to the central changes after.
So does this
Potentially.
come back to the peripheral versus central? You're
Yeah.
saying those are two different
To open.
things.
Because it provides the feeling that all tinnitus are related to plasticity,
Yeah.
and we are not sure about it.
Can you give an example? What?
sorry, Jared, can I raise a concern about what we're doing at the moment?
Yeah.
We could discuss this until tomorrow easily, especially in this group.
Send Arno out.
No, I have another. I mean, it's a very interesting thing we're doing because I think it's the basis for, let's say, where we want to attack in the future.
Yeah.
This is maybe a very interesting work to be done, maybe by a group that is coming together today in whatever means and whatever setup. Of course, with you because you disagree with everyone. This is so that you're definitely a member, and to actually bring that to a point where the starting point for, let's say, at least 95% is, because if we start now to discuss that and do some phrasing, I think we'll miss valuable time discussing.
Yeah. But what do you suggest we do?
I would say that maybe after this round, we'll bring together maybe 4 people, let's say, who mostly disagree. That may be the best thing. And actually to bring that together to a point where everybody is more or less on the same stand would be something very interesting as an outcome of this whole.
But so basically the same what we're trying to do now, but in a smaller group, or
in a smaller group, and give them some time because, as I say, we can go on.
Yeah.
I think
Well, we're gonna do breakout sessions in the next session. It's all
or maybe we give it into a breakout session, whatever. But I'm just saying, I think we're losing valuable time now if we start discussing.
We could skip this whole thing and move to the next session.
No, it's absolutely, it's a cool thing to do. I don't know if the setup here is.
Yeah.
You would like us to become more specific.
Yeah.
To make it something that everybody agrees on, you're just going to neuter it. You're going to defang it. So we have it so bland.
Yeah, because it's so
just
generic
to
that
nobody.
it's meaningless.
So you're going to
Yeah.
take the whole exercise in the wrong direction by trying to make it something that nobody could object to.
Okay.
If you want it to, and to appease 75% of people,
Yeah.
then it could become very specific and the 25% can
Yeah.
go pound
I
sand.
think
But then it could get very
I'll take
specific.
75%.
That's a different
Also the 75% can be wrong. That's me. That is correct.
Yeah.
So the question is, what is the whole benefit of the exercise?
Yeah.
Because it's not because 75% things agrees that is correct.
Well, maybe it's more useful to then,
In business, we always say how it doesn't work. I know myself.
yeah.
So
Disagreement is fundamental to science, and
Yeah.
it has always existed
Yeah.
in every field, astrophysics,
Yeah. Yeah.
biology. I mean, you think how people disagreed with the evolution. The idea of evolution was contentious for 100 years or more.
Yeah.
The cumulative agreement function.
Maybe it's more useful then to look at the unknowns.
No, but
Set.
just to maybe the debate, it's interesting to check if we have a consensus, in this group.
Yeah.
It's also, I mean, it's not easy at all.
No.
Maybe it's a minimal consensus, but it's interesting,
Yeah, it's super
Because just-
interesting.
yeah.
But it needs a little more discussion time than
Then we
possible.
go.
It's possible.
Yeah.
But for research, it's very interesting.
Yeah.
you're even disagreeing at the meta level.
Okay. Yeah, what I would maybe propose then is that we look at the unknowns instead, and it's a pretty long list. And maybe from that, if we could distill, like, what are the most important gaps that we need to close? Because again, like, it's quite a lot of stuff that people have listed. Again, it's on 2 different slides, so I'll show you again. This is slide 1. Neural mechanisms, biological underpinnings, objective measurement, subtyping, and then chronification, lack of therapeutic targets, and the research and infrastructure gaps.
I mean, some of these points we already
Discuss.
discussed.
Yeah.
So maybe we go to the points we didn't discuss here.
discuss it for
Can I put
We
some,
didn't discuss the codification points.
Yeah.
Can I put something into the room that I think is one thing we also not discussed here, but in general, when I see, and that's a fortunate thing that Hazel and Marco and we see a lot of research in general, so what people are working on. And today I have the feeling that there are 2 paradigms that exist in this field. That the one part is the subtyping. So this, let's say the group that believes that there are different subtypes of tinnitus with different approaches and of course different paths to attack them. And then there's a group that that thinks even though we have those subtypes, there has to be some central pathway.
Yeah.
That there's a common ground for all of them.
Yeah.
And I think this is, I don't know if that's a good start off, but this is something I see as a big discussion point in the whole field is, again, where do we put resources on? Yeah, so maybe that's a kickoff. That's interesting.
Maybe you can start by asking a question: who believes in a final common path?
I was thinking about that, but I was scared.
I'm
No, why
very
not?
curious.
Who believes that there is a final common pathway, even for all the subtypes, or who believes that there is different final pathways? Because that's what Sven is raising.
Yeah, but we are talking about subtypes, comorbidities, or
Subtypes.
or for tinnitus percept. Tinnitus
It's
percept.
very general.
I mean, and pain, we know there's 7, or at least in the ICD, there's 7 different types. And tinnitus, there is no recognized subtypes as far as I'm aware.
subjective and objective, which we don't like.
Which we don't like. So if we don't like it, then there is none. I mean, like I don't go say there is so much essential, but that's virtually it. That 70% has it, and the question is, does it make any difference on the treatment or
Exactly.
the approach? So
That's the question. Yeah.
but maybe we can ask who believes there is separate subtypes with separate pathophysiological mechanisms, or who believes there is one final pathophysiological mechanism, and that can be fed by different subtypes.
I believe there are separate pathways.
But why?
Shall we do the poll? I really want to do the poll. So
Yeah, okay, it's fine to do the poll, but I mean, how on earth should we know? And
We don't.
no, so
this is
well, that's
feeling. I have a gut feeling about it, so I'm just gonna.
yes on that. I'm not voting because I mean, it's very obvious how
We first should
There's-
honey and finding subtypes.
Okay, who believes there is a final common pathway?
Can we ask once more?
No, I want to vote.
No, that was
Final pathway. Tinnitus, for example, with and
Sound
without
percept.
hyperacusis.
or the sound.
So for the sound percept.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
Who believes that? So okay, 1, 2, 3, 5.
I don't know.
A big 10. Yeah, I think it was 10.
But I understand your point. But
yes, I mean,
no. But the thing is,
But there's more or less.
again, I know it's horrible to put business tactics into this field. It's a thing of managing resources. If you think about that, there is a whole variety of subtypes that need different attack angles, then you would start, first of all, define what are the most common subtypes.
no, but
Because otherwise you die in
yeah, but I fully
indefinite subtyping measures and without ever trying to approach the problem.
No, I fully agree, but and I also fully agree with the business approach. But what does it tell us if the people that are here in this room do or do not think that? I mean, therefore you would need systematic evaluation of what's out there, and then we could. I mean, because then people like me will also vote, and I'm not a neurobiologist. How should I know?
Yeah.
So
So that means that it's sort of 50-50 split. You have to ask
Yeah.
them who is
Abstaining.
against this and who is not voting.
And I'm abstaining.
Is it competent?
But in the end, it's crucial because you basically work on what you believe. It does. It's
That's true.
I'm sorry, we're coming here on the religious part of the thing. Is you will always work on what you believe out of your whole complex of what you studied and what you're working on. The next step is always belief. It's never, because you don't know.
Then still the pro. Yeah. No, I disagree, sir.
Yeah.
I do agree with that, but I don't agree that voting there.
No, but it was
It was a curiosity.
Yeah, he has a
Not
curiosity.
saying
Not
anything, but very
No, I think it solves something. So I like this
okay.
because I don't think it makes sense to think about all unknowns because these are so many, and we also can find a cure without understanding everything.
Yeah.
But I think that what is important is what impedes us to find a cure.
Well, that was exactly what I wanted. I want you to identify from this long list of unknowns which are the crucial ones to resolve.
Like, but I think we should start with the crucial ones because
Yeah,
otherwise,
exactly.
and I think what Sven mentioned is a crucial one.
Yeah.
And so if it turns out like 50-50, it means it's a real unknown
Yeah.
because among us experts who know a lot about tinnitus, we are not sure something like that. So I think that's very important, which means that it's definitely an unknown. So and I think that's something
The
we have to
unknown
consider
that forms
in our
impediments
that's
to
something-
finding a cure is what you're saying, right?
Yeah. What are the unknowns that are
Yeah.
impede us finding a cure?
Yeah.
And it's not uncommon in all research fields that exist that there are two main theories that compete against each other. It's not, I think in physics, it's since the early dawns that they compete on that. And I think that's it's in the secondary step for all of you, it's quite crucial for where will we put resources into. That's actually a very crucial
So
discussion.
I don't know, another question for the group. So the first one, precise neural mechanisms of tinnitus, is that one crucial to resolve, to find a cure?
No, it already depends on the question on subtyping, because
It's
if
really
you have different subtypes that differ in the pathology, then you have different mechanisms, not just one. You have a finely common pathway. It would be very important to identify this final common pathway.
I'm really convinced that the patient who has a fluctuating tinnitus because he has Meniere's disease.
Yeah.
What does he have? Sorry.
Meniere's disease.
Yeah.
With vertigo and
Yeah.
hearing loss. Another who has a constant tinnitus because he has had a nose trauma.
Yeah.
A third one who has a unilateral tinnitus because he has schwannoma on the nerve. A fourth one was a fluctuating tinnitus modulated by sleep. Some patients say that when they sleep in a nap, they increase their tinnitus loudness. All of them are totally different. They come up the clinic with a different clinical pattern, and I manage them in a totally different way. I can't imagine that they all have exactly the same mechanism underlying the percept, just the percept. I can agree a little bit on the fact that if they suffer from the tinnitus, whatever the kind of tinnitus, it may be a common pathway in the suffering system in the brain. I don't know what it is. I don't know how it works, but I can at least accept that. But I will never accept the idea that all my tinnitus patients have the same underlying mechanism.
No, but that's not the point. The point is not that they have the same mechanism. The point is you have different mechanisms that lead to put it simple, auditory activity with consciousness-related activity. That's it.
Well, it's the point. No.
But you can have different mechanisms.
You find a cure for one of the film. So this is the point.
What is the word modifier? So the modifiers who change the tinnitus percept, which to the end is the same in every person. What needs mechanistically to percept must be. It's a neuroscience law, for my opinion, that percept means there is no sound outside, but sound inside. But the modifying, in the one case, it can be sleep, because but these reasons, the one is stress or something, the modifying factors can be different. Can we agree on this? But the percept, to the end, the mechanism in the cortex must be the same.
It's good. Disagree.
So I don't agree with that, and that you can say it. It's you can state this. I have no payment for this as a source that is wrong. My opinion is a little bit different. I think that because of the different peripheral mechanisms, the consequences on the centers should be different too. Or I have. That's a theory. That's a theory. I have no clue. I have no biomarker, so I can't. I don't have it, but there's a second proof that. But that's I don't think that the patient who has a Meniere's disease has exactly the same neural activity in his brain compared to a patient who has a constant tinnitus after an hearing loss induced by a noise trauma. It's short in one case, long term in one other. It's a different sound. It's a different percept. It's a different everything.
Yes, but this is solvable. If you have a large database, let's say of fMRIs, EEGs, it doesn't matter, and you can find with 99% accuracy that you have one network that is correlating, and you have multiple different causes, then that would suggest that there is one final common pathway. If you have a very low accuracy in detecting it, then you might have to go and do whatever you have to do another approach. So I think this is solvable.
Yes,
but isn't that the same like
to be tested?
When you have a cardiovascular problem, just as an example, you'll have, I don't know, 20 patients with different kinds of symptoms, some will have the pain in the arm, some will have, I don't know, be throwing up or whatever it is, just as an example. But the central problem for all of them is the same, and the way how we approach this and attack it is the same. The symptoms might be different because as we all know, as you say, this is exactly the variety of symptoms that different patients experience. My question is only, is the attack point that we are looking for, do you think it's going to be the same in the end? Or do you think it's not going to be the same in the end? Because that is
It's not the same.
okay.
It's what Alain says, and I agree with that.
My feeling is that it's not the same.
Yeah.
I have
not the
no
same.
clue. I have no proof. I can't
But
I can't state that. But with my gut
feeling.
because I've seen so many cases. My feeling.
Yeah,
I
I love gut feeling.
Also I agree with Alain because for sure there might be altered activity in this final pathway, the auditory system and the perceptual system of the brain. But the question is, pathology there within this fine pathway? So is this altered activity due to a pathology in this part? Or is this altered activity just a consequence of a pathology which is somewhere in the periphery?
Doesn't matter. That doesn't matter as well.
Why is it matters for this question was being where you should treat it?
No, it doesn't matter.
No, he's meant to say about the teenage eye fill out questionnaire neuron is like the common path. Right? That's why.
The acoustic neuroma is biotransfer approach. You remove the ear, the air cells, the whole thing, and the nerve.
Yes.
Can you imagine that this has exactly the same consequences of the brain reaction when compared to a patient who has a Meniere's disease with an attack that lasts 5 hours, with a very severe tinnitus for hours, and then
Deprivation is deprivation.
Yes.
A quiet room, earplug, conductive loss.
But isn't it a loss of intake of information? If you damage a nerve, if you damage the nerve, if you damage the cochlea, if you erase any kind of intake,
change the Meniere's disease for an intake of salicylate. 3 grams of salicylate induces in about 100% of the patient transient tinnitus. With an hyperactivity in the auditory nerve. Is that the same thing than when you remove the cells, the ear, the nerve? I have, if it's all that the consequences of the same, but the peripheral mechanisms are totally different, and my assumption is that the consequences on the brain are different.
And
It's an assumption.
And for eye drops, for instance, it's not a differentiation. So it's the pressure in the cochlear. And then
It's the total volume of electrical signal going through the auditory nerve, regardless of what the.
but if you want to target, if you
it doesn't matter if it's a bioelectric
but
potential.
if you want to stop tinnitus,
Yeah,
so for instance, if it's a plasticity or if it's at the cochlear, so then it's a completely different approach if you want to show it. So complete.
Oh, yeah, well, I don't know. Actually, I don't agree with that. These are clearly different, right? They are different sources. There's no question about it. But and the percept is all cortical disinhibition, and that's why you can even go cold turkey on benzodiazepines and without any cochlear insult. And
For one subtype, maybe, but not all.
no, all subtypes. I mean, I'm going to say something that is falsifiable, right? Right. I mean, that's the whole point. I'm not trying to. Am I going to say something you're all going to agree with? That's going to be boring. So, all tinnitus goes through cortical disinhibition, and so you can cancel out all tinnitus, irrespective of this upstream cause, by fixing the exact pattern of disinhibition. So take that as something which probably most of you disagree with, but I would say that I believe that.
Going back to your question, where's the right target to attack? And I think then the question is, are we focusing on symptomatic treatment or are we focusing on causal treatment?
Sure.
Because it's a focus on causal treatment, we have to go back to the real origin, like Meniere or whatever. If we are happy with symptomatic treatment, then you might come to a target which is a more common target. But I think that's an important question.
But I think that's with every pathology the same. If you can treat the cause, you treat the cause first. But if you remove the cause, that doesn't mean that the symptom is always gone. Most commonly it is, but not always. You see the same in pain, chronic pain. So once if there is at the end the patients, of course, if they have a tumor, they want it removed, but they want their tinnitus to be gone, and then ultimately we'll have to treat the symptom. If resolving the cause doesn't remove the tinnitus. And the idea is that but this is a belief, that the final sound percept is generated by a network that can consist of activity, auditory, combined with consciousness enabling activity. And that should be it, because if you would have 10 different possibilities, we don't just have brain enough to generate 10 different versions.
Yeah. But I think we agree properly. If we agree that it's possible, we should try to treat the causal pathology first. Then I think we also should agree that we should try to identify the cause in the individual patient, and this means that we have to subtype tinnitus. For symptomatic treatment, there might also be a common pathway which can be a target for symptomatic treatment. But I think if we agree that causative treatment is always the first option, then we also agree that subtyping makes sense.
Yeah, but you can also treat it individually without subtypes.
Yeah. But what do you mean with treating? So what do you exactly mean with treating individually? What is that?
Trying to identify Meniere's disease as a potential cause of the tinnitus, and then treating the Meniere's disease.
Or the cause that Alain said, whether it's a neurinoma or whether it's a vascular compression or whether it's whatever, it doesn't matter. Something that can link to the sound percept.
Yeah. So that's then just treatment for something that the patient suffers from. So that's very logical that you would do that if you can treat that, right?
Yes, but it doesn't mean that that's a subtype.
That's like super limited.
But that's just where I was heading.
Yeah.
But that is super limited, that we actually know that's one thing is not with Meniere's. So Meniere's is but with a lot of those other things, it's very, very not often happening that we know that this thing is exactly causing that type of tinnitus in this individual patient. So that I'm not sure if that's the basis for solving the issue here.
Yeah, so the majority of the patients, I think, will not have a schwannoma, will not have Meniere's disease, but they will have something different. Many of them, maybe not all, many of them will have a problem with hearing, even if it's small.
Or not detectable.
Or not detectable when you think of hidden hearing loss. But I think we should maybe focus on the majority of the patients and not special cases where we can even treat a schwannoma.
I know how it works, but that's why I asked what an individual treatment means, because I think that every patient needs to have an individual treatment. But if you mean like patients with a schwannoma in which you need to treat that seems like an obvious option that you definitely need to do that. But as you said, and as we said, for the majority of patients, that's not the deal.
Sorry, just as a question to Dirk and Dan, because I think you're on the same point of that. My point is that exactly that's what you're saying. The majority of the patients will have some underlying pathology that restricts a intake of information to. It doesn't matter if the cochlea has been damaged or the nerve has been damaged. The result is the same. I mean, if you damage the nerve and the cochlea is perfectly fine, you will have the same problem as if you damage the cochlea and this nerve is okay.
No,
so there is it doesn't really matter where it comes from.
Thanks.
So, and I would say this is, I don't know, for all the clinicians, that is probably what 90% of the, or let's say 80% of the patients you're seeing. That's probably underlying primary cause that they will tell you.
But
So
doesn't
that
every
is my
adult
point.
alive has some form of hearing damage? So that doesn't like fully explain the problem.
No, it's not. I mean,
Okay.
you have patients with hearing loss without tinnitus.
Yeah. and
You have
vice versa.
patients with tinnitus with hearing loss, and you have patients with tinnitus
Yeah.
without measurable hearing loss.
Right.
Or with schwannoma or whatever other underlying diseases that should be treated by themselves and not for the tinnitus.
But by the way, the majority of people with hearing loss don't have tinnitus.
Right.
Letting it, yeah. So with
True.
the distinguishing.
Yeah, that's what I totally understand.
But we have no idea why it is.
We should doubt about the model, and I agree with the plasticity and so on, but we are not sure.
No, we don't know why some people develop tinnitus and most people do not. We have no idea.
Yeah,
Even if they have the same identical hearing loss.
So the question is, the very important question, why and how does the chronification happen? To some patients and some...
Or tinnitus development and then following chronification.
Yeah, this one. Yeah. That's a crucial.
That's a crucial point.
There is very interesting literature in pain, again, that shows that from a genetic study, that if you do not get an inflammatory response, so if you don't get your inflammatory genes activated, then you develop chronic tinnitus.
When you're not active,
When you do not, which is interesting because it means that the acute immunological response is important to prevent chronification. Now we're focusing on getting rid of immunological or an immune response once it's chronified. But it's just one publication, but it's a very interesting publication that suggests that if you don't get this activation of or expression of genes in the acute stage, then you're at high risk for chronification.
And this means that the treatment with corticoids would be and I think there's some hints from the large German multicentric study for high dose corticoids for hearing loss, which results in a worse outcome compared to a low dose of corticoids.
respect to the point where you ask, like, just as a hypothesis, if you have somebody with a damaged cochlea, whatever, noise trauma, whatever the reason was, if you would be theoretically be able to repair that, would then the tinnitus be gone? Or is it still in the chronification in the brain?
Yeah.
So that is something that is it's a theoretical question, but it has some
disease in cochlear implant patients.
Yeah, in cochlear implant patients, as soon as the cochlear implant is switched off, tinnitus comes back.
Yes.
Tinnitus doesn't disappear. It's a reduction.
Okay, yeah, that's residual.
This is my point. Is it masking, or does it really go? I think that's from my perspective as a patient. There's a difference in masking your tinnitus with input. Can be also loud noise. It's still masking, or is it really going away? Whatever that's that is a different, because many times I read that the cochlear implant, let's make it very easy, makes the tinnitus go away for a certain amount of time, but that actually doesn't exist. You know what it's very hard to describe. It's masking is this whole different thing than actually that the tinnitus is gone. And I think the only thing we're talking about in cochlear, this is just again gut feeling, is that we're talking about a masking situation, because
So the effect is much better compared to hearing aids. Yeah. If it would only be masking, we would expect a similar effect. And there's also some patients where the tinnitus is gone. We discussed it at lunch, whether somebody says the tinnitus is gone, whether it would be a hard outcome. And it's also difficult because sometimes if you ask the patient, says before you asked, it was not there, but now that you asked, I focus my attention on it and it's still there. But I think it's really in some cochlear implant patients below the level of awareness. They got implant switched on. I think you might know better, Kelly, but I think it's not a matter that there's additional power. So even in an environment which is quiet, just by this kind of baseline activity which comes in, they have a very efficient suppression of tinnitus. And it's much more efficient compared to hearing.
But it could be, I can tell you that from a
sometimes the loudness of a masking, whatever it is not the most important. I can tell you, for example, if a train passes me at full speed, it actually increases my perception of my tinnitus. But the lightest, for example, dropping of white noise in water, for example, and I'm talking about a very, very silent happening, that totally masks my tinnitus. Even though it's relatively to the sound I percept in my ear, this sound is almost nothing, but the right frequency masks it 100%. It's not possible for me to percept it anymore.
And that's what we are trying with our lists approach.
Yes, can he did a PhD on
Yeah, sorry.
and so she might actually have felt
So there are this masking effect, which is about getting the auditory input, but there is also another mechanism of action, which is more into giving an input which is not auditory. And so we have done some studies about subthreshold stimulation. So there is no hearing percepts, and still tinnitus was reduced, which means that it's not only masking and giving an input which is perceptible, it's giving an input to the brain which is enough.
Yes.
And so it's not only masking, there is something else in the cochlear implant which is not happening with hearing as the instance.
Yes. I presume Konstantin and me, we are very happy that you mentioned this, because you have the same with 90%, I presume, if you go to the soundproof chamber, they got tinnitus. So what does it mean? This means that ambient sound and noise activates something which suppresses the brain mass.
Yeah.
So you go to the sound chamber, and this means you retract the ambient noise. And a lot of evidence supports this is the easiest explanation for the cochlear implant switch on and off. This is the easiest explanation which I mentioned last time, so that congenital deaf children obviously do not have tinnitus. But when they mature and get the first time experience-driven baseline improvement of silence, then they have a risk in tinnitus. So this means it confirms we need ambient noise in the frequency.
In the
Very
right
low,
frequency.
very soft. And there is from Jena, this is there, we have evidence for this. So this is a little bit contradicting the general feature. Stimulation should be not regarded. I assume we should consider this.
The right stimulation.
Yeah. The right stimulation, exactly. In combination with Barbara.
But it doesn't have to be sound, as Gary said. It might just be electrical signals.
Yeah, that's the point.
But if it's sound, it's the most easiest. It's cheap, it's doable, it's non-invasive. It can be
He cannot implant everyone with.
Yes.
Yeah, really.
Maybe another unknown. There are people that have tinnitus for many years. They have chronic tinnitus, and then tinnitus disappears. There are these people, and Tani Sanchez has a collection of more than 100 patients that have proven to be chronic tinnitus patients, and then tinnitus disappeared for whatever reason, and they tried different treatments, and many different, and treatment A worked for these people and treatment B for another person. And then she followed them up for 1.5 years to check if tinnitus really does not come back. And she has at the moment more than 100 patients where tinnitus disappeared and stayed away for more than 1.5 years. So what's happening in these people? For me, that's an unknown here. So one question, was that linked to a therapy, or did it just like disappear out of the nowhere? Well, but very often it was linked to a therapy. And sometimes it makes sense. So sometimes when I looked at the data, there were people complaining about TMJ, and then they say, the treatment helped me was physical therapy. So that makes sense. And not in all cases it makes sense like that.
Is this related at all to residual inhibition you're describing?
Inhibition, really something to kind of because it's only short.
Short enough, yeah.
Short.
Just a few seconds.
So here's one theory would be that, okay, so I make a lot of recordings from the brain At a cellular level, there's a lot of spontaneous activity. Let's assume that brain activity itself is not read out as a conscious percept, unless under certain conditions, a conscious percept is elicited by, say, activity of the auditory cortex when the spontaneous activity closely approximates the activity that is mapped onto a prior history with a certain sound experience. So when the spontaneous activity approximates the activity that is elicited by a sound, we perceive that sound. So it's probably certain cell types that are really essential for doing the statistical matching, probably the projection neurons of the cortex, for instance. But there can be all kinds of noise, all kinds of activity, but unless it slips into this one pattern, which usually is like a synchronized, spatiotemporally localized activity, there's not going to be a tinnitus. So all you have to do is not, eliminate elevated activity. You just have to prevent the activity from assuming the pattern that would be read out as a percept. And so a theory about what happens when people have a long-lasting suppression of tinnitus is that that particular sort of attractor network, right? The floodplain that the water goes down has been broken. So the water isn't flowing through this one pattern that is always being mapped onto a perceptive sound. That's all we would actually have to do, independent of the causes, to permanently eliminate tinnitus, is just never let the spontaneous activity of consciousness generating networks assume statistically the same patterns as recognizable sounds.
So then that raises the question, and have you rib a person of these priors, if you will, that give rise to that gate opening? Well, I feel like there's other easy guns.
So you could maybe argue then, or maybe you do argue that in these cases, tinnitus is kind of a self-sustaining loop in these brain networks that we have can go on for several years. That's a chronic case, and then it's possible that you disrupt this self-sustaining loop, and then tinnitus is gone.
Yeah.
That would argue also for this discussion about the common pathway.
Could be.
Yeah.
It could also mean the priors keep being reinvented to give rise to the perceptives. So you have to break the attractor, so to say.
Yeah.
Yeah, you have to disrupt those sustaining and the much working. Self-sustaining network.
Self-sustaining network kind of attractor.
Okay. I'm going to try to wrap this up. I think we made some headway in terms of agreeing on the main areas of disagreement, right? and I've highlighted some. So why some people with hearing loss develop tinnitus while others don't. Is there a meaningful way of subtyping tinnitus? Meaningful in terms of, treating or curing it? Is there a final common pathway or not? And how does acute tinnitus become chronic? So yeah, I think it's an outcome of today's brainstorm. And I would suggest we break for coffee for half an hour and start again at 3:15 with where we're going to work in breakout groups.